Just a heads up, this video does have spoilers, probably duh. And if you aren't familiar with the show's science fiction mechanics, including what an innie and outie are, you can watch my previous video or pause and read it on the screen right now. Welcome back, everybody. So last time I made a video that shows 10 ways that Severance depicts the nightmare of corporate life and just kind of what corporations do to us in general. And as I worked on it, I realized that a lot of the show and the ideas were tied up into the characters and their personal journeys. So I thought I would make a video kind of exploring things along those lines, and I hope you enjoy it. Now, before we move on, just a really quick bit of channel maintenance. First, remember to please like, comment, subscribe, stuff like that. Also, I'm going to try to mix things up on this channel, kind of like I said I would when I started it. I've been doing a lot of scripted stuff. These first 3 videos are pretty much purely scripted, even though I treat them more as an outline. So I want to make things a little, not necessarily off the cuff, but more just me talking to you. So I'm going to work on trying to do that. I might move that to another channel so that my more scripted developed stuff is here and my more just talking to you off the cuff, sometimes shorter videos will be over there. Might even do live streams on it. So if I do that by the time this video is released, you'll see it in the description box and also in a pinned comment. Turns out I did do that, and the channel is called Mr. Zod Extracurricular, so go ahead and check it out if you want. Finally, I am thinking, and probably will have done it by the time you're watching this, of changing this channel's name to Mr. Zod. Mr. Z was meant to be an allusion to my previous channel, Prophet Azad, and I didn't think a channel's name mattered that much, but I'm just not vibing with the name Mr. Z. I think it sounds a little weird, kind of generic, and I'm getting the impression a lot of you feel the same way. So that change will probably be made by the time you're watching this. If not, who knows, I'll probably update you somewhere in the description. So now on to the video. So this show is focused on 4 characters who work on a team called Macro Data Refinement. Their names are Mark, Helly, Irving, and Dylan. These characters' journeys show us different ways that people struggle to remain human within a corporate world, usually by in some way rebelling against it. The characters are going to be ordered based on where they become most relevant within the story, so for the most part this is going to remain kind of chronological. First is Helly. Now Helly is a very interesting character, at least literally within the show. I wouldn't say she's the main character, but the show opens from her perspective, and she kind of seems like the main character until we get introduced to Mark. Basically, she's the fish out of water character who we see learn about and test the boundaries of the severance process. The show opens with her waking up in a conference room table acting totally disoriented. A voice over an intercom starts asking a series of questions, and it becomes clear she has no memories, or at least very few memories. She doesn't know her name, the color of her mother's eyes, or the state she was born in, but she can answer when asked to name any state or territory. So it's immediately clear to us as viewers that she has some general knowledge but no personal knowledge, and that the company asked these questions to make sure that that's the case. Now, Helly responds to this the way you'd probably expect, which is, by totally freaking out. When Mark comes in to talk to her about her answers, she throws an intercom at his head, overall yells and panics a lot, and eventually demands to leave. Now, Mark says she is free to go whenever she wants, but the problem is that every time she tries to run out the door, she just finds herself re-entering the building. And we eventually learn that every time she stepped outside the door, her memories were wiped and she turned into her outie. And since her outie still wanted to keep working there, she would just walk back inside, reactivating any Helly's memories and creating the illusion that running out the door just let her back into the building. And I have to say, this scene is extremely well done. All in one fast-paced, high-energy sequence, it shows us the mechanics of the severance process, sets us up to understand Helly's contentious relationship with her outie, as well as the callousness of outies toward their innies in general, and leads to Helly's growing sense of disorientation and panic. Now, Helly's panic leads her to become more and more disruptive in the first few episodes, and I think there are a couple ways of looking at this. One might be that she's just generally a disruptive and rebellious character. Could that be? Maybe. But I suspect it has more to do with the situation she just found herself in. She just woke up in a place with no memories, only to discover that this is going to be her entire life. This is it, living in this bunker with no memories of a previous life, under control of these weird people. And every time she walks out the door at night, she's just going to walk back in the next day to do the same thing over and over and over again. And the last time she finally does walk out that door, that's just it. She won't know anything else, at least as the person she is. So it seems inevitable that anybody would react the way she did, right? And in fact, the safeguards built into the intake process show us that they were expecting new hires to freak out. But here's the thing. When Helly meets her coworkers, she finds that they're compliant, even strangely docile. And that might just be the single most chilling thing the show reveals to us. All these people had experienced the same thing she did. Like Helly, they woke up with no memories. Like Helly, they learned that all this was going to be their entire existence. Like Helly, it slowly dawned on them that there would be no escape. So how did they become okay with this? What could lead a full-grown adult, who at least has some of the maturity of someone with real-life experiences, even if not the memories, to go from freaking out about the situation to being quietly resigned to it? What would that journey look like, and what kind of person are you once you've given up to that extent? It's really kind of scary to think about. It was one of the most unsettling details of the show's initial world building, and one of the big things that Helly was struggling against. The more she learned, the more she discovered not only that escape was impossible, but that the very concept of escape was illogical. Because if she could even leave, to leave would be to end her existence, so this was the only life she could ever know. But even that wasn't an option, because at least in some twisted way, some version of her, in the form of her Audi, still wanted her to be there. And what recourse do you have against yourself? What recourse do you have against a company who looks to that part of yourself to make the decisions for you? So the more she learns, the more she realizes that she's just hemmed in on all sides. Everything about her situation funneling her down to the logical end of becoming part of the system. Not just being trapped physically, but actually having her sense of self reduced to being okay with it. Of being okay with having this just be her life. And that felt inevitable because that's what everybody else became, and it seems like there's no path to anything else, right? So what else is possibly going to happen? There's this really strong tension of her wanting to resist, but realizing she's going to stop resisting at some point, probably. What else can she do? Basically, I see her as symbolizing the struggle against having your life and identity reduced to that of a corporate drone. Like Helly, we all find ourselves in circumstances that push us toward having our time, energy, creative space, and mental and emotional energy all consumed by some form of corporate life. We can feel trapped by the realization that this is all we can be. We have very little chance to become a better version of ourselves. And like Helly, we can also be in some kind of internal struggle against a part of ourselves that is resigned to this or wants to push us into it, kind of like she's in a fight against her Audi. So I think her fight with her Audi, people could see it different ways. One person made a pretty good comment to a video saying that once you sever somebody, you turn them into the working class and the owning class or whatever. And it's more a representation of the exploiters and the exploited. I think that's a pretty good interpretation too. And again, these can evoke different ideas at the same time. But one way I see this is that it's just, we all have that internal struggle, whether to just give in and go with the flow and live a comfortable life versus that thing inside us that wants to just hang on and be who we actually want to be. So we kind of not only want some way out, maybe some way to support ourselves in a way that we prefer without the corporate world, but we're also struggling in a way to maintain a sense of self, to not have so much drained out of us in this rat race. And I think the way Helly's struggle captured this is pretty brilliant, to be honest. Most of her storyline is about her continued desperate attempt to get out. She submits a resignation request to her Audi, but her Audi refuses. She tries sneaking messages, but they get intercepted. She even tries performing or threatening acts of harm that would eventually be suffered by her Audi, but to no avail. All that happens is she gets worn down by company discipline in the break room, and her Audi sends her a video essentially saying, "If you do anything to hurt me, I'll keep you alive and miserable down there long enough to regret it." Eventually, she becomes more outwardly compliant, at least for a while, interacting with her coworkers and trying to meet her macrodata refinement quota. Of course, the big twist with this character, skip forward to the chapter on Mark if you don't want it spoiled, is that she's actually a member of the family who owns Lumen, and it appears she underwent the severance procedure as some kind of public relations stunt. Now, given the symbolism of the internal struggle of whether to, go along with a corporate life or try to do your own thing, I could see this maybe as being Helly struggling within herself whether to go along and meet her family's expectations or, find her own path or whatever. Maybe that's what her fighting with her innie is about, or vice versa, fighting with her Audi is about. But to me, this one feels more like a dramatic reveal within the literal workings of the show. Like I said last time, not everything, if you see symbolism, not everything has to add up to that symbolism. Sometimes the show is just there to be a science fiction show, to, give you the novelties of people being severed and struggling with that, and to have their little dramatic twists and turns and stuff. So that's how I read this one. Anyway, let's move on to the main character, Mark. Since he's the one we mostly follow throughout the show, we see what his day is like from start to finish, including at home, at work, and the transition in between. This lets us see a lot more of what being severed is actually like. Why a person chooses to do it, how they deal with actually being severed, what everybody else around them thinks about it, just kind of how the whole thing fits into society in general. And Mark's story seems kind of like one of loss and trying to find meaning and connection, just personal warmth within a cold corporate world. While Helly lashes out in this desperate rage, Mark succumbs to kind of a more quiet desperation. Basically, he just gives up when his wife dies, essentially. To this end, Mark uses the severance procedure to forget about her for 8 hours a day. Now, a lot of you might be wondering what this actually accomplishes, because he doesn't actually spend 8 hours a day forgetting about her. At least not in his experience, right? In order for that to happen, the severance procedure would just have to selectively excise the memories of her specifically while allowing him to remain the same conscious person. But it doesn't do that. Instead, when he walks through a door, all of his memories are gone, so essentially he just spends 8 hours a day being a different person, meaning he never actually gets to enjoy the relief of forgetting his wife. But it did accomplish something, which is that it saved him from having to carry himself through a day of work while grieving or being depressed. Sure, every moment that he's awake or can remember, he's going to be sad about his wife, but nothing's expected of him during that time, so he can just kind of zone out. And this is where I see kind of a metaphorical meaning in Mark's decision. What he's doing is kind of the equivalent of using a corporate job as a coping mechanism, a way to compartmentalize yourself in a way that would kind of allow you to deal with grief. See, Mark had previously been a history professor, and while this job was something that I think he found fulfilling, I would assume so anyway, he might have enjoyed that career, but it was something that took mental effort, and it was something he probably carried home with him, even if not a workload. It was still an actual interest, and so he was probably thinking about it. Basically, his home life and his work life were more integrated because his work life was something fulfilling. It might be that kind of job that is actually part of you, part of how you actualize yourself or view your identity, maybe something that Helly was looking for. Mark voluntarily gave that up because while it was fulfilling, it was just too much effort to handle that while also dealing with the trauma, so he just kind of gave up on it. And he did this by getting a job where his home and work selves were more separate, where he could spend half the day sleepwalking through meaningless corporate tasks and the other half drinking and collapsing into depression. Now, I'm not saying that getting yourself through a day of corporate work while depressed is nothing. That would be really stupid to say and also very insensitive. It's hard in any situation. But I've been through traumatic experiences both as a teacher and a corporate employee, and dragging myself through the second one was a lot more manageable. I didn't have to be as on, I didn't have to be quite as mentally engaged all the time. So different story for everybody, but this is just to say that in many situations I can see how that's the case. I think the symbolism here is pretty intentional when they show Mark quitting teaching in response to grief to just go corporate and collapse when he goes home. But this theme of loss only continues when he actually goes into his corporate job. And the show makes this very clear in the first scene of the show after the intro. It starts with Mark's Audi crying as he's driving to work about his wife, though we don't know that yet, and then transitions to his innie self only to immediately discover that his friend Petey had resigned, which means that he suddenly was just gone. The poor guy just can't catch a break, huh? And this would be a lot to take in, especially when we consider that Mark's innie self is, I think, just about 2 years old. All of that time, just the 8-hour segments of living in a cold, sterile office space, and as far as we know, Petey had been his best friend. In fact, that might have been Mark's only experience of friendship, so this was a lot, right? But the way it was handled was careless to the point of cruelty. So one day Petey's not there, and Mark's just called into his manager Harmony's office and told that he had resigned. Just like that. No goodbyes, no explanation, with Milchek even saying they couldn't explain because that would be an assault on Petey's privacy. Milchek then says, "I'm sorry, you were one of my favorite office friendships," as if they were characters on a soap opera and not real people. And Harmony says he can request a handshake as congratulations for being promoted to Petey's position. After this, Mark engages in his first little act of disobedience against the company, which is taking all the team photos that include Petey off the desks and putting them in a closet. Now, this is totally understandable, right? Sitting there staring at pictures of his suddenly vanished best friend probably triggered a lot of poorly understood, bottled up feelings inside him. And so he dealt with it just by taking the pictures and putting them out of sight. But alas, this is against the rules because, as Stickler Irving is quick to show him, the handbook says you're supposed to keep the pictures out until the new team photo is taken. So the writers are going out of their way to show us in no uncertain terms that corporate culture is just totally indifferent to people's feelings. Mark's childish innie self had no clue how to process all the emotions he was feeling, and his workplace did nothing to encourage him to help him understand any of that at all. So a person leaving, no matter who they were, no matter what kind of friend they were to you or anything like that, is just a matter of processing paperwork and making sure that their task is covered somehow. I see this as a clear symbol for how cheaply personal relationships are treated within the corporate world. In fact, it's so direct I have trouble calling it symbolism. It's pretty much open on-the-nose commentary about just how flippantly corporations are about personal relationships. When you spend almost half your waking hours within a specific environment, you're going to develop a sense of self that only belongs in that environment. And then that self is going to forge relationships and even friendships with people over that you spend all those long hours with, right? But then when you move along, either voluntarily or involuntarily, then suddenly you just need to fold up that identity and let it die. And then suddenly all the relationships you developed are over both for you and the people you left behind, except in whatever capacity you decide to stay in touch afterward. Considering how much time we spend with coworkers and the possible friendships we developed, this might affect us in ways we don't even realize. Now, I know I could easily be too dramatic about this. Most of the time, coworkers move on. You just have that awkward time where, you're saying goodbye to them. You're not sure exactly how you should feel about it. Are you supposed to give them a handshake or a hug? How much are you supposed to text them afterwards? So it might not be a big deal, but it could be more of a thing than we realize. It doesn't really maybe hurt. We don't really miss them hugely. But I think that messes with you to be that transient in your relationships. But some relationships can get real enough that this whole thing and how it's handled can become a little cruel. Basically, this is all about the commoditization of identity and friendship. Our employers basically require us to cultivate workplace identity and foster relationships with our coworkers for the sake of making us more effective employees. You have to grow as a person to fit your role at the office. You have to make connections so you know who to reach out to get things done. You have to be able to relate personally so you can operate as a team. And you're going to develop some personal feelings about this because, well, we are human and we tend to develop feelings about things we invest ourselves in. But then as soon as the business does not need these things from you, then suddenly it's not personal, it's just business. We can more effectively make a few dollars without you here, so go somewhere else and be someone else with other people. Oh, and I guess don't have an income for a while. It seems like this idea is what Mark's experience with PD is trying to evoke using the exaggeration of his severed status. Mark's compartmentalized workplace experience obviously did not heal the trauma of losing his wife. All it did is allow the corporation to exploit him by putting him through further trauma at work. This all seems to leave Mark with an almost haunted sense of emptiness, hungry for the connection and meaning I'd said he was looking for. And it seems like this is what pushes him toward further transgressions against the company. A new world opens up to him through a book called The You Are, which Mark finds in the office due to a convoluted set of circumstances. The author, the Audi's brother-in-law Rick and Hale, left a copy at his door when his boss Harmony, who poses as his neighbor, took it to examine it in case it had hidden messages. She gave it to Milchick, who lost track of it during an emergency, and Mark found it and read it instead of turning it in. Now weirdly, he and his coworker Dylan think the book is just absolutely profound, which is funny because the book is very deliberately portrayed as the kind of over-the-top self-important nonsense that only the author and a few of his especially polite friends would ever take seriously, or pretend to. But Mark, however, just totally eats the book up and it changes his perspective on everything. But why? Why would he like something so obviously stupid? Does this make any sense? Well, it kind of does when you consider the fact that the indie characters in this show are basically babies in terms of life experiences. They've been alive for a few years at most, and everything they've been exposed to in terms of writing at least is nothing but, like dry corporate manuals and memos. So if they've ever read anything clever, it was probably from one of those people who think they're cute for suddenly saying something silly in the middle of some training materials. I mean, admit it, you've all seen that at some point. So I'm sure that to the severed employees, every piece of overwrought phrasing was like a profound revelation. Every performative gush of emotion a breath of fresh air. I bring this up because it very neatly sums up a lot about Mark that I don't want to go into in too much detail here. First, of course, is that it sets off his journey of discovery and eventually rebellion. Second, it gives a window into the almost equally dreary life he is living in the outside world. He's close to his sister, but their social life, seemingly revolving around Rickon's book and his hipster friends, is dominated by a quasi-academic pretension that feels almost as stifling as the severed floor. This seems to be the show's way of saying that modern society outside the office is not only no help against corporations, it's almost as empty and pointless itself. I take the message kind of as being that corporations leave us so starved for meaning at work that we'll basically gobble up any tripe that they throw us at home. We think that stuff we encounter in the real life is creative, is real or whatever, but a lot of it has been piped to us through corporations. So, whatever. And third, the fact that Harmony took something so personal from Mark's home and appropriated it for workplace monitoring shows an appalling lack of work-home boundaries. Office life doesn't stop at the office door. Nothing in your life is so personal that it remains private. And this is the last thing that Mark's story shows us. Everything is in the reach of corporations, and none of it is so sacred that they won't reach their tendrils into it and warp it for their own purposes when they want to. Because see, Harmony showing up to Mark's house and taking his book was just the beginning. That's not the only thing they did that intruded into his personal life, not by a long shot. And by the way, big end of season 1 spoiler if you want to skip to Irving's story here. Because it turns out that Miss Casey, the wellness counselor at his job, is actually his supposedly dead wife. So apparently Lumen had led Mark to believe his wife had died and then paraded her in front of him at work. And that's just incredibly cruel, right? In the most twisted way possible. The corporation felt entitled not only to take away Mark and Gemma's relationship, to leave one grieving and the other a permanently severed shell of herself, but to put the couple in the faces of each other's workplace selves. Why? Well, it's still a mystery at this point. Maybe they were trying to see if Mark and Gemma would recognize each other. They're trying to see how complete the severance process was. But we don't totally know at this point. One thing, though, is clear. Lumen did not feel constrained to access people for 8 hours a day in exchange for a paycheck. It felt free to meddle in their lives to the point that the very idea of a personal private life didn't exist anymore. And I wonder if the show is trying to say anything about corporations with that. Anyway, on to Irving, and this section is going to be kind of short because I found him to be a fairly straightforward character. In fact, in the beginning, he just comes off as a one-dimensional stereotype meant to irritate the other characters. The guy who's been around the longest and is a stickler for following rules down to the letter. So just a boring, uptight guy. But the show slowly fleshes him out and we start to see that there's more beneath the surface. As soon as macro data refinement meets optics and design, he's quickly smitten by an O&D employee named Bert. The two have a cutely naive will they won't they thing that's loaded with tension due both to their innocence and the fact that office romances are discouraged. Irving never quite goes all the way to will they, but he flirts with a possibility heavily enough that it's clear he's willing to bend or skirt the rules. This is the show's extremely unambiguous way of saying that there's more to Irving than just following the rules. However, this there's another side to him thing in and of itself is just a very surface level reading of the situation. There's a bottled up humanity behind his exterior, and in fact his exterior as the show goes on starts to look like a way of containing and processing who he is. See, it would be very easy just to show Irving being a stickler for the rules in some scenes and selectively breaking them in others, and just suggest either some level of hypocrisy or a basic transformation as he learns to loosen up. In doing this, there would be a danger of making the person just look like two characters and saying, hey, look how he's changed. But the show doesn't do that. Irving remains basically the same uptight character throughout. But when his desire for something becomes strong enough, then suddenly he can rationalize a gray area into the rules. Or more interestingly and to the point, he can use the rules to his benefit. When he wants to see Bert, he doesn't just say so. He does things like suggest that the teams meeting up would be good for unity, or point out that the soap dispenser should technically be labeled. Always an excuse to go address something with O&D. This suggests motives behind Irv's rule following, not just now but before. Like when he told Mark they were technically supposed to leave team pictures out until the new ones were made, was it really all just about the rules? Or was it driven more by him wanting to see pictures of his old coworkers as much as Mark didn't want to see them? Like maybe the two were just dealing with their poorly understood grief in different ways. We can't know that for sure, but the way the show handles Irving's character just leaves a little bit of ambiguity about what's going on in his head. It makes his character feel human, and I just really like that. All this little slight rule bending comes to a head when he comes to O&D and abruptly learns that Bert's retiring. There's this weird but heart-wrenching melon bar party celebration, and they wheel out a TV and play a recording of Bert's Audi giving an extremely generic goodbye speech. Meanwhile, Bert just seems kind of absent during the whole thing, like he's either in shock or just confused, and eventually it all just becomes too much for Irving. And for obvious reason. Someone he was clearly falling for is going to die, all just because some random Audi decided it was time to retire. Or maybe if not that, maybe the company forced the issue because they wanted to stop their budding romance. Either way, it's just too much for Irving, and he flips out about the whole thing. Even calls Milchick a smug motherfucker. Milchick lets it go, and Irving pretends to play nice for the rest of the party while deep down, his dissatisfaction is just continuing to simmer. Now, there's probably a lot more to Irving than that. He's one of the most mysterious characters in the show, and I think we're going to learn a lot about him in Season 2. He had worked at Lumen for years before getting severed, and I think a lot of people, I'm not sure why, but a lot of viewers suspect that he's been severed multiple times. Maybe he's fallen in love with people and kept getting severed, who knows. But basically this means the company resets his memories when he's at work, by the way. His Audi also repeatedly paints pictures of the hallway leading to the testing floor, which is pretty mysterious, has a list of severed employees, and is secretly investigating Lumen. So lots there clearly, and I look forward to seeing how it plays out. Finally, we have Dylan. Like Irving, Dylan seems like a blunt stereotype at the start of the show. Both men displaying an annoyingly excessive and performative enthusiasm for their work. While Irving exhibits this through adherence to rules, Dylan's obsessed with job performance, meeting benchmarks, and his overall identity with a team. He lives to earn the frivolous perks the company offers, and has such tribalistic loyalty to macrodata refinement that he becomes the primary pusher of paranoid rumors about OND. Basically, he's the guy who buys into every motivation the company dangles in front of him, which makes him at the start come off as kind of a one-dimensional comic relief character. But what's crazy is just how drastically this changes in one scene. Dylan had stolen a card from OND because of his suspicion of them, and Milchick is so desperate to get it back that he uses the overtime contingency to activate Dylan at home and ask him about it. As I explained last time, the overtime contingency is a tool the company can use to activate an employee's innie on the outside. Now, they really don't need innie seeing the outside world, so Milchick is very careful about the whole thing. He tells Dylan's son to wait on a couch and make sure Dylan is in a closet where he won't see anything. But, kids are unpredictable, and Dylan's son bursts in and gives him a hug. And this immediately changes his character. From that moment, he's just absolutely brimming with pent-up rage and is all in on the effort to subvert Lumen. Hell, he even physically attacks Milchick during a party. Now, I could see how this just might be perceived as sloppy writing. Dylan was one way at the start of the show, and then just on a dime, he suddenly becomes a different character entirely. His character changes a lot really quickly. But as always, we need to remember how emotionally stunted and just basically immature these characters are. They are essentially babies who have lived a few months or maybe years in just one environment, a very sterile and emotionally stunted environment. So Dylan's overtime experience was his first time seeing his son, but not only that, it was his first time seeing literally any child. He had never seen a child before this point. All he had seen was the few people around him in the office. It was also his first time receiving a hug. Interestingly enough, he had asked Miss Casey for a hug. It was played for laughs, but I don't think it's an accident that they showed that and then getting this hug from his son suddenly changed him so much. I think it was a pretty transformative experience. So I see this contrast between Dylan before and after this as a very deliberate choice by the writers. It's actually pretty smart when you think about it. It reveals that his enthusiasm for stupid things like finger traps and egg bar parties was not funny as much as desperate. He was a deeply repressed person who had, trapped in this environment, going from the probably freaked out thing like Helly did to this resigned thing in this weird underground office, had settled for the meager excuses for human experience offered to him by the company. And so finally seeing his son and realizing what he had been missing this whole time just set him into a rage. Think of how much he was experiencing in that moment, seeing a child, knowing it's your son, getting a hug. What does that do to you, and how are you going to experience your office, or how are you going to view your office experience and the little things you accept from them there? By now, I think the point of this character is getting pretty obvious. It's about the intrusion of work into home life. Like I'd said last time, workplaces like to get you to settle for things like on-the-job rewards, recognition, little ways they make being around work fun and comfortable. If they can get you happy with that, maybe you'll advocate for yourself less in terms of pay. Or more than that, maybe you'll just get comfortable being at work and not be in such a hurry to get home. to the point that if work-life balance gets complicated and home life gets a little bit difficult and stuff like that, you might be tempted just to settle in at work and live for your superficial life of corporate rewards and workplace drama, things like that. Work can just become a comfortable place to be if it's hard to juggle. Dylan seems to represent this problem. He had settled for all that stuff. The perks on the show are a lot like the little things work tries to use to make you to get comfortable. But then finally, the overtime contingency, representing, of course, overtime intruding more into your personal life, just got to be too much. It intruded too much on his home life. And at some point, something flipped in his mind, and he recognized all that he had been missing, recognized the actual home life, the personal connections that he'd given up too much of. And suddenly it exploded in just this massive outburst of rage. And he recognized what he couldn't get back. He was probably a little mad at himself and at work. Well, in the show, he's probably mad at his Audi, but maybe that represents the internal struggle. Who knows? But, obviously, this is a pretty imprecise comparison, right? Any Dylan had no knowledge of his family, and the whole process actually gave Audi Dylan more of his perceived time with them. So it's not really precise, but it seems like the story is kind of trying to do something with this. And I think there's just something profoundly sad about somebody realizing that their entire life or too much of their life is work, and just realizing how much that they've disconnected from people at home. So I found Dylan, especially as a parent, to be an overall compelling and sad character. But the more I think about it, the more all these characters show different aspects of, what corporate life can take from you and how people try to put up some kind of resistance. Helly just hated the whole idea of being trapped in corporate life and fruitlessly raged against it. Mark tried using it for his own coping purposes, but eventually he, along with Irving and Dilling, were pushed too far by the company, and the four banded together and tried to rebel. Now, the prospects, at least to me, seem a little hopeless at the end of season 1. And by the way, if you don't want spoilers, this is probably a good time just to shut off for the rest of the video. Sure, they did find out how to use the overtime contingency to wake up their Audis on the outside and, tell the world what's going on. So it did seem like they'd found a silver bullet solution. They had temporarily escaped their outside selves onto the outside world, and they were just going to blow it open and reveal what was happening. But it seems like the company was just always one step ahead. They're always in the pockets of politicians. They always know how to spin their messages. Harmony is starting to figure out what's going on and looks to stifle them. So I think the message is that you can find your ways to try to push back, but the corporations are always one step ahead of you. They're just way too powerful. They've been through this game. They know what it looks like when someone tries to resist. And so, I don't know, we always end up being stymied by the people in power. That's the vibe I get off the show. I hope for the characters that they do manage to make it work out. And I hope for us that in the coming years in real life, we can try to work things out too and fight our own fight. So I guess we'll see how both those things go, right? Anyway, that was my second video. I'm going to be moving on to other things other than Severance after this. If this wasn't your big thing, if you're not much into Severance and stuff like that, looking to do other stuff, more variety on this channel. So as always, let me know what you think. Have a good day, everybody.